And now it's time for us to discuss more of these headlines and simple keywords with Adam joining us via Zoom. Good morning, Adam.
Well, good morning, Lena. It is Christmas Eve.
Yesterday, Diane told our listeners it was Christmas Eve.
Right. Well, we can go on forever, can't we?
We really could. Simple things. It brings me joy. Yeah. All right. After what feels like a prolonged tug-of-war that would see no end, there seems to be an end. Let's start with our first keyword of the day.
But it's agreed.
Rather dramatically, rival parties have reached a tentative agreement on next year's budget. Tentative might also be a key word there. What's the latest?
Tentative might certainly be a key word and is a bit of a jittery one at that, because you never know if it can be broken. But yes, there have been some compromises made, for use of a better word, I guess. Both parties, they did agree on a 1 percentage point drop in the corporate tax. That was one of the key sticking points. That was a major hurdle between the rival parties and one of the main areas of debate between them. The cut applies to the highest marginal rate of 25% and the rate charged to smaller companies of 10%. The People Power Party have been pushing for a 3 percentage point reduction on the maximum 25% range, basically the top 25, citing the relatively high tax rate weakening competitiveness in the global markets. The Democratic Party earlier accepted a proposal by the National Assembly Speaker, Kim Jin-pyo, to lower the maximum rates by 1 percentage point. Now, the corporate tax reform was, as I mentioned, the biggest obstacle that kept the two parties from reaching an agreement. Under the compromise, 4.6 trillion won was cut from the initial government proposal, which was initially 640 trillion won. One of the major cuts is downsizing the budgets for a newly created police bureau set up within the Interior Ministry and the newly created department under the Justice Ministry that will screen candidates for high-ranking public officials. The budget that was initially proposed at 5.1 trillion won will be cut by 50% as well. The agreement also includes plans to allocate 352.5 billion won for local gift vouchers and to add 660 billion won to help reduce borrowing costs of low-income families who are provided public rental housing. The two parties have also agreed to vote on several major pieces of legislation as well while they were at it. This includes extending a freight rate system for cargo trucks that expires at the end of the year. Of course, that was one of the points that led to this whole trucker strike that made headlines recently, as well as allowing the Korea Electric Power Corporation to issue more debt as well, something that could result in higher electricity costs going into next year. Also, both the budget and the corporate tax cut reform will be put to a vote today, but as is everything with the National Assembly, we don't know if anything's finalized until a vote is passed. So we'll have to see what happens today.
All right. And with that, we move on to our second keyword of the day.
Indoor mask rule.
So Korea's indoor mask mandate could soon be lifted with an announcement on the rule to be made later today. We can make some predictions. What can we expect?
Right, well, People Power Party leaders met with top public officials, health officials yesterday. The officials laid down the possible conditions for pausing the indoor masking rule. They plan to switch the indoor mask wearing requirement to a recommendation if certain conditions are met. This includes COVID-19 hospitalizations and death rates falling. Of course, health officials aren't really concerned about the daily numbers. They're more concerned about the hospitalizations and the severe cases and the deaths. Those are the numbers that they are most concerned about. So those numbers need to be falling. But people using public transport and medical and welfare facilities, basically places that are highly vulnerable to the virus, will likely still be required for these indoor masks. And officials seem to think that the timing seemed right to do away with the indoor mask restriction, considering current circumstances. The PPP's policy committee chief Sung Zong noted that even if case numbers rise within the lifting, the government has enough medical personnel and facilities to respond But he also hinted at the possibility of the mandate being reinstated if infections spiral out of control, or if there is the emergence of another dangerous variant that we don't know of yet. Now, on the mandatory 7-day quarantine, that's another COVID-related restriction that still remains. Sung said the PPP suggested the government reduce the isolated period to 3 days, as argued by some health experts. That's the same quarantine period that's designated to medical professionals. So that is basically a benchmark timeline that is being under consideration. The possible easing of the indoor mask mandate comes as cases are still relatively high, though. So there are still some concerns there, especially with this possibility of a winter resurgence. But before or around the Lunar New Year holiday is being reported as a possible time frame for easing, the mask mandate. But of course, we'll have to see how the trend is. Even though there is a kind of relatively high number of cases, health experts are saying that Korea is much better prepared for this kind of jump in numbers. But won't know anything until the announcement is made today.
And even it seems that after the announcement is made today, if the numbers spike next January, for example, it's perfectly acceptable that we would go back to these standing restrictions too. I mean, if the pandemic that has lasted for 3 years taught us anything, is that nothing is for absolute certain. I mean, we talk about these variations and mutations, something that we're also keeping tabs on. In the meantime, let's move on to our third keyword of the day.
Grading system.
Oh, that's fun for everyone, isn't it? For the professors, for the teachers, for the students. All right, so Korea has planned a new educational curriculum, which includes the changes to the grading system and what kind of classes it seems that students can pick and choose and design it according to their own interests.
Yeah, so it's kind of a system that's similar to what universities have in Korea. So basically just starting that system a bit early on in the academic cycle. The Education Ministry wants to finalize the plan by February 2024. The changes would apply to those going to college in the year 2028, which would be current middle school first graders now. The plan includes implementing a credit-based curriculum for high school that's similar, as I said, to what universities do in Korea. That would give more choice to students on what classes they wish to take. It is a system that is being used actually in some high schools currently, but the government wants to, of course, expand the system to all of them, at least by the year 2025. But some experts are warning that more preparations are needed to implement the plan by then, so it could take longer. A whole educational reform and revamp of a whole grading system, of course, would take a lot of time. So I think the government is wary of that, but they are having set the target year to 2025, but we'll have to see if that deadline or timeline rather can be met. Now, under the plan, high schoolers would need to fill 192 credits in order to graduate. Each class and subject would have varying credits. For those who are unfamiliar with how that kind of system works, basically in university, your average lecture is worth 3 credits, and you need to fulfill a certain amount of credit. I don't know how it is in the US. It's probably similar as well.
Really similar.
It's a different. Oh yeah. Well, in the UK they use a different system because British people like to be different in every way possible. But
is that accurate?
But yeah, I mean, for American viewers, you know what it is. Basically, 3 credits worth for one lecture, pretty much, and there's a certain threshold that you need to fulfill if you want to graduate. So basically, that's the system they're looking into implementing for high schools as well.
Okay, so there you go. It seems that it maybe allowing students to choose their own curriculum might give them more power to design what they're interested in. However, like you said, changing an entire education system has persisted for years. It takes time, so we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, especially in a country where the National College Entrance Exam is probably one of the biggest events of the year.
Yeah.
I don't know how that kind of reform and change and revamp would apply relative to the new grading system as well. Like, how would exams be held if students are choosing their own subjects?
Right.
So It's a tough one. I don't, but that's not for me to decide. That's for the government to decide. So I'll leave it to them and the experts.
Because you asked about the American education system, we had SATs and SAT2s, and
Right.
SAT2s would
Okay.
be kind
Yeah.
of like the subject test. And that
Yeah.
might be one of the many examples we can benchmark. Now, framework, we understand the
Mm,
technicalities and the small steps. We'll keep tabs on that. Let's move on
mm.
to our fourth keyword of the day.
Gloomy economy.
So there's yet again more data regarding Korea's economy that that actually paints a pretty gloomy portrait. This time, Korea's financial stress index has surged into the danger range. Can you tell us the details?
Well, if anything has the word danger in it, obviously it can't be good, and it's kind of red flags for the economy, and it certainly is. Now, the FSI is in the danger range, as you said, due largely to U.S. monetary tightening and increased volatility stemming from a credit crunch that was triggered by the developer of Legoland Korea defaulting on debt. Bank of Korea data shows the FSI, which is based on real economic and financial indicators, stood at 23.6 and 23 in October and November, respectively. The BOK said that expanded market volatility from the issues mentioned before have restricted some intermediating functions of the bond and short term money markets. Now, following the 2008 global financial crisis, FSI rose as high as 57.6, and for the next 11 years, stayed well under 22, the line
Mm.
that indicates the so-called danger range. Now, it broke the 22 threshold in 2020, rising as high as 24.7 when the pandemic started, fell back, and then broke through 22 again in October.
Mm.
Meanwhile, the ratio of private credit against the nominal GDP around the end of the third quarter stood at a record 223.7. That's up about percent. That's up about 1.4 percentage points from the previous quarter. The ratio of corporate credit also jumped from 116.6 to 118.5. Loan debts by small business owners are also expected to surpass 40 trillion won next year.
All right, we move on to our final keyword of the day.
Ukraine conflicts.
So, Russia's President Vladimir Putin says Russia wants to end the war in Ukraine and that this would inevitably involve a diplomatic solution. It does seem, given the timing of it all, that Putin is wary of Zelensky's sit down with U.S. President Biden.
Right, so it seems like he is feeling the pressure to end the war, but then he's got comments and actions that suggest otherwise as well. So it's a bit of a mixed bag of messages and comments coming out from the Russian president. But his latest comments do come a day after Joe Biden hosted Volodymyr Zelensky in the White House and promised him continued and unwavering U.S. support. Putin vowed to strive for an end to the conflict and saying that the sooner the better. But White House spokesperson John Kirby said Putin has shown absolutely zero indication that he's willing to negotiate an end to the war. He said Putin is a man who wants to continue to up the violence upon the Ukrainian people and escalate the war. He reiterated that Biden was open to talks with Putin, but only after the Russian leader showed what he called a seriousness about negotiations and after consultations with Ukraine and US allies. So yes, he is going to talk to Putin, but after talking with everyone else first, basically. Russia has persistently said it is open to negotiations, but Ukraine and its allies suspect a ploy to buy time after a series of Russian defeats and retreats, pushing more of the momentum towards Kyiv. Now, Russia says it is Ukraine that is refusing to talk, in fact. Kyiv says Russia must halt its attacks and give up all military territory it has seized so far, if talks wants to happen. Putin also played down the significance of a Patriot air defense system that Biden agreed to supply to Zelensky, saying Russia would find a way to counter it. Putin also said a price cap imposed on Russian oil by Western countries would not damage the Russian economy. He said he would sign a decree early next week to set out Russia's response. So he's basically saying he wants to end the war, but he's hinting at other kind of areas of possible conflict as well. So it's a bit confusing.
All right. As you've said, a lot of mixed signals there. I'm sure there'll be
Yeah.
an analysis through the weekend. And then next Monday on a World News segment, we'll give you the updates. Adam, thank you so much for this week's coverage. Happy
You're very welcome.
holidays.
Happy holidays and a pre-Merry Christmas.
See you next week, Adam.
See you next week.
If you're listening to our program using the podcast service, just a reminder that we do go live Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. Korea Standard Time. So tune in and help us make the show more informative by giving us your input. See you bright and early on Good Morning Seoul.